World War I. And prior to World War I, the federal government was beginning to be more involved. Remember the whole concept of progressivism? Progressivism, in a literal term, means that we have faith in science. We have faith in experts. So if we find a problem, social or otherwise, we can solve it. But part of that solution often involves a law. And as we talked about this, progressivism begins locally. We spoke about the progressives in the big cities, dealing with sanitation, safety, security. So people were being active and they wanted their mayors to pass laws. Remember the Triangle Shirtwaist factory. You may not remember the name, but you guys all know when I say the word, you know what I'm talking about. This was this big building, is about, 15 stories high, which at that time was a total skyscraper. And up on the higher floors, they had a factory where they were making shirts. And prior to this, there were some problems with union strikes. Prior to this, there was problems of theft. And so the management barred the doors to the fire escape because they didn't want people to make the items and then steal it. Well, there's a fire, which is why you have a fire escape. Nobody could go out the fire escape. And so people were actually jumping out of the windows so that they wouldn't die. Well, they jump out of the windows, 13 floors, they die. I think I even had a picture there. The body is on the street. And the people, the newspapers, were taking pictures of that. Do you think for a moment that anyone was not horrified by what they saw? Of course not. Everyone was horrified. And immediately, what did it do? The Triangle Shirtwaist factory, the reason why it's in history, is immediately it led to passing a whole bunch of regulations. You have to have sprinklers everywhere. You can never, never, never bar the fire door. And, oddly enough, ironically, you have to have rules on safety conditions for women. They shouldn't be in a place like that. They shouldn't be working so much like that. I say ironically because people look back and say, well, you're being discriminatory. Well, it's because they saw the pictures of women being hurt. The point is, at the local level, immediately, they passed laws. Laws to protect. Now, you don't know this so much, but it didn't take very long for progressivism to move from the cities to the states. And one of the ways that we see this is in crime control. You've heard of organized crime, mobsters and stuff. Well, they had mobsters back in the 1880s, especially in Louisiana, 1890s. Chicago and New York had a little bit of this. What they began to do by the late teens, or the early teens, is to establish state boards, state justice departments. And their goal was to make sure that if you are a bad guy in Chicago, you can't run off to Alton, Illinois and hide. The whole state will be looking for you. And so they're consolidating, and they're doing this to protect. It's part of the 3 S's: safety, security, sanitation. This is the safety part. Also the security issue. And so we do this in terms of crime control. We also begin to do this with sanitation because our water has to be clean. You may be living in Chicago, but where does a lot of this water come from? Maybe from someplace else. State levels. And all these experts that we're relying on, where do they come from? So the states begin to get involved, and before you know it, and I don't know if you put 2 and 2 together, but the reason why I mentioned the election of 1912, and not only is it important because the Republicans split the vote between the Republicans and the Bull Moose Party, which led to Democrat Wilson being elected, but all 3 of the candidates called themselves progressives. And the reason why this is important is that it had begun moving to the federal level. Now, it became a federal issue mostly in terms of your ideology and your rhetoric. But in practice, you had trust-busting. Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Roosevelt more than Taft, They wanted to break monopolies. This is using the federal government to kind of break and control parts of the economy. It was still relatively minimal. A trust is a violation of the free market because if they have a monopoly, then you don't have competition. Competition is what makes the products good because people are competing. So you get rid of the monopoly and then you have more freedom to make a better product. And that's the argument. It also allows new ideas, new people, little guys to do well. That's the argument behind it. It's a progressive idea. So we begin to see this. But, as I mentioned, fairly minimal. How does this get expanded after World War? Why is World War I? We call this a watershed event. What does that mean, a watershed? I don't mean like an actual shed. It has to do with groundwater. You guys know what a watershed is? Think in geology. If you are you do a map of the watershed of your property, right? And you've got, and you're looking at where the water is. If this is the high point, and this is the low point, and your house is up here, okay? Where don't you want the outhouse?
To go deep.
No outhouses here. Why? Because then it will go downhill into your house, into your well. So you want your outhouse downstream. Make sense? Super easy. It's a watershed. You think of a watershed as kind of a defining moment. You could say intercontinental divide and have the same principle. Do you guys know what an intercontinental divide is? If you are a boy and you're driving down across the country and they have the sign that says intercontinental divide, you really have to stop. And I'm not going to say anything more. But it's required. What is an intercontinental divide? It's required. I'm sorry. What's an intercontinental divide? So here's the continental. The continent. I'm going to give you another. Here's the continent. So there's the Olympic Range, there's the Rockies, and then there's the Mississippi. So intercontinental divide is the high point. So if you take a glass of water or any liquid and you pour it here, if it's on this side, all the water is going to go this way. If you're on that side, all the water is going to go that way. For us, American history, it's very important because we bought, in Louisiana Purchase, all the lands that drain into the Mississippi. And so when you look at the Mississippi, let's see, this kind of looks like the country. It totally doesn't. But if this is the Mississippi here, right, and this is the Rocky Mountains, we bought all the lands that drain into the Mississippi. So the Louisiana Purchase kind of looks like this. All that drains in the Mississippi. It's a continental divide. That's a concept when they talk about a watershed moment. The watershed means it is kind of a defining moment. There's a division here between two sides. So we begin to have progressivism, which is very much something before World War I, because we talked about this. Progressivism, you could argue, our entry into World War I, even though it was initiated by German submarines, the fact is, when we went in both feet because we are going to change the world. This is a very progressive ideal. The League of Nations, the war to end all war, this is truly faith in science, our ability to change things. And yet, there's such a difference between before the war and after the war. And tell me why. You don't have to read my mind. I'm not looking for a specific answer. Just tell me, what are some of the things that changed? I mentioned some of it already earlier today. Go ahead. Okay, it did. Now, we weren't involved with it. That was a progressive idea. Go ahead. But it did. Go ahead.
Are you talking about on a world level or like a...
Good. United States level. I mean, good question, because world level, it does big different. Local.
Prohibition.
Yes, that's true. Prohibition. Is this a progressive ideal? Oh yeah, of course it is. It's an experiment. Drunken men got us into the war. Let the women vote and get rid of alcohol. That seems a simplistic summation, and it is, but not that simplified. That's kind of the idea. We get rid of the vice, we get rid of the problems. Very much progressive. And so we still see this progressive. But what you see here, of course, is it's a law. A federal law. Okay, what else do we see after World War I?
The products of factories.
Ah, that's what I'm getting at. Money. We just talked about this. The scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal. There's so much more money. Why is there more money in the country? Wasn't the war just destroying things?
They didn't have to invest as much money.
Well, where did it destroy things?
Overseas.
Overseas, in Belgium and France and parts of Germany, but not in the United States. Our factories aren't touched. And in fact, in order for us to supply those troops, what do we have to do to our factories? Ramp them up. And you're absolutely right. You ramp up the economy, and then after the war, you just shift it from military purposes to civilian purposes. And so you've got just a screaming economy afterwards. And new technologies. What are some of the new technologies that you have? I talked about toasters, appliances, dishwashers, cars. I mean, cars have been around, but it was right around 1915 that Ford really is introducing the assembly line. What's cool about the assembly line, I think I mentioned this, is that his assembly line was 1 mile long. He had a building that was a mile long, a mile, straight line. You'd had interchangeable parts and things, and people doing something like an assembly line, but his was really unique. You come off here, you put the frame on, and before you're done, right at the time, you turn it on, you drive it off. So one line, it's extraordinarily efficient. So assembly line, right? Cars. What else do we have? Same type of mass production. We have radios. Radios had been around since before the war, but they weren't really mass produced. In 1919, 1920, most of the radios you got came in kits. They shipped it to your house, or you buy it at some store, and you put it together. By the early 20s, you're buying them off the shelf. Beautiful radios. I don't know if you've seen old-time radios. I mean, the cabinetry, it's just a beautiful thing. Radios everywhere. Why do radios matter in terms of federal regulation?
Transmission of information, like media censorship.
Not censorship, although you're kind of, you what?
Announcements.
Close. You guys are talking, transmission is exactly what I'm getting at here. How many radio stations do we have here in Richmond Center? We have 1 here. How many can you get if you're flipping around here? I don't know if you guys listen to radio anymore. Maybe a dozen, right? Okay. What would happen if Bob, Ron Fruit owns WRCO. What if Bob decides to create WRCP, okay, right next door, and he decides he's going to broadcast on 100.8 FM. It's not 100.9, it's 100.8. What's going to happen?
You get our care, 100.9 care rate.
What happens is radios become real popular. There's no federal regulation. People are putting up transmission stations everywhere. Think of New York City. There's literally hundreds of transmission stations. You turn on the brand new radio and you can't hear a thing because there's so much crosstalk. So how do we solve this? Yes. What do we call that regulatory body which was started under Coolidge? FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And their job is to regulate the bandwidths, right? The new technology created new reasons for the federal government to start regulating things. Not just in radio, but a whole host of things. And as the economy gets bigger, how often are you going to have a company that crosses state lines? Very often, especially when we not only have radios, but we have telephones, which means it's very easy to communicate over state lines. We've always had telegraphs. But the point is that there's kind of a watershed in the demand for this regulation. That's my point. So we go way back here. Maybe this. Okay, so Coolidge. Coolidge, reform, restraint, hands off. Now he's introducing kind of a definition of restraint that really fits in with the past 50, 60 years. But the reason why it's unique is that it fits in with the 50, 60 years, but it's a totally different environment. There's a lot of call for people to have federal involvement. Coolidge was the one who came up with this idea. It was actually not Coolidge, it was his undersecretary, a guy named, do you know who the Secretary of Commerce was? You actually do. You know his name, you just don't know who he was. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover comes up with the FCC. Herbert Hoover and Coolidge are kind of hand in fist. They both agree that restraint is kind of the best way to approach this new environment where you got tons of money. In order to keep the government out of corruption, you don't get involved. Even in times when you could get involved, you don't get involved. And that's kind of defines his administration. But he's also doing this at a time when the economy is booming. He lowered taxes, I mentioned, but also the revenue increased. In other words, you lower the amount that people pay, and yet we get more money. What does that mean? What has to happen for that to happen? If I'm selling a candy bar for $5 and I sell 10 candy bars, how much do I make? You guys are super easy. $50, okay? Now, I suddenly cut the price of my candy bars from $5 to $1. And by the end of the day, I got more money than I would have if it was at $5. What does that mean?
Your supply has to go up.
I had to sell a great deal more. In fact, that's what happened. He lowered taxes, the revenue increased. So what's happening to revenue? What's happening to just the productivity in the country? Absolutely going through the roof. But this is not a surprise to you because we talked about this last class.